Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. We are continuing our lecture from our chapter on social structure theory. Again, that's chapter 6 in the third edition, chapter 5 in the second edition of Criminology by Frank Smallinger. This lecture is based upon Criminology third edition by Frank Smallinger and the slide deck provided with the textbook materials. So we're going to move on and we're going to start talking about culture conflict in this section as soon as we get to the appropriate location of the lecture PowerPoint right here. I think that's the right one. I actually moved it because I was talking to one of our fellow students on the phone, and I forgot to move it up to where we are now. So, as you know, so far in the first 3 lectures, we got an overview of what the social theories are all about. We got to look at what social structure is all about. We got to look at social disorganization and strain theory. And now where we want to go is something called culture conflict and subcultural theories. You should have your textbook nearby to follow along. There's a lot more detail in the chapter than I'm going to give you today in this brief lecture. But what we're talking about in culture conflict theories is basic idea that the root cause of criminality is found in a clash of values between differently socialized groups over what is acceptable or proper behavior. So this is that definition that I just read. Thorsten Zellen studied culture conflict, had an idea of conduct norms that a social group would have. So this could be explained, and it is explained in the book, in relation to that zone of transition that we talked about previously. When we're talking about social structure, you have different groups, cultural groups moving in, say, from different countries, different foreign countries, different immigrant groups, and they have different cultural values or cultural norms. And that clash of cultural values or norms is culture conflict. One example that is provided in the textbook is someone who moves into a community and they commit a homicide where they actually kill their daughter, because in the culture that they came from, it is normal to preserve the reputation of the family if someone goes astray. Someone, maybe she dated somebody outside the culture or went a little further than that and embarrassed the family. In some cultures, it's actually okay to eliminate that person from the family. So we have shared expectations within a social group that might then clash with the expectations of a different group within the same culture or in different cultures. So you have 2 types of culture conflict: primary conflict and secondary conflict. So again, the primary conflict, as I said, was when you have a fundamental clash of cultures. Sellen's example was the immigrant father killed his daughter's lover, following an old world tradition that demanded the family's honor be kept intact. Now, I said kill the daughter. You've heard of honor killings, I'm sure. There are cultures that believe that it's okay to eliminate a family member, even if they embarrass the reputation of the family. A secondary conflict was when smaller cultures within the primary culture clashed. So further the example, because our criminal laws are based on so-called middle-class values, then there's a clash if the lower class folks within the community don't have those same values. And examples back in Zellen's day were prostitution and gambling, where in some communities that was perfectly acceptable, while in others it was not. And of course the laws said it was not as well. Today, the example might be in communities where drug use is prevalent and acceptable compared to the overall cultural where it's not acceptable and still illegal. And we get down to things like marijuana, where you have some definite conflicts in that there are some folks that believe it's perfectly fine, and still the law is prohibited in most states and certainly federal law. And there's a clash of cultures in that, some people, if there were a bunch of people in the field or in the park adjacent to my house here smoking it up, and that odor is carrying into the neighborhood, you may have people that aren't going to like that. So that could also be considered a secondary conflict, if you will. Subculture theory or subcultural theory. We have various socialized cultural groups within our communities, and we're talking about, what is their contribution to the phenomena of crime. And what is a culture? A culture is a collection of values, ideas, beliefs, and traits that characterize a human group. Now, this group or culture could be based upon, their ethnicity, what country they may have come from, because every immigrant group that comes into our country has different values and norms that might come from their particular culture. We talked about one cultural issue, which may or may not be considered a clash of cultures, but certainly was a cultural issue that contributed to crime, in that there was a prevalence, and it may still exist, for certain people to not trust the banks in the countries that they came from. So if they were to open a business, and very prevalent in the Asian community, where maybe they open a business, and rather than using the banking structure in this country because they didn't trust the banking structure in their own country, whatever country it was that they came from, and it's not only Asians. One of the people in the class suggested that there were cultures that their family came from that had the same issue. They keep their money in their homes. Maybe it's under the bed, maybe it's in the freezer, wherever it is. And it's not because they're hiding it like a criminal person would, because there's a limit to how much money that you can transfer back and forth under law, and they're trying to hide it. But these folks, hardworking, good people, but again, refuse to use the bank because of not trusting it in their community. How does this lead to crime? It leads to crime because other people within the same culture know about that practice, and maybe even people who are outside of that culture who might work for these people would then know that they have all this money stored in their home, and that might open them up to a home invasion robbery situation. And there's been several of them in this community, in the Philadelphia area, both in the suburbs and in the city itself. Sometimes if the restaurant, or whether it's a restaurant or laundry or nail place or whatever it is, and it's doing really well, and they have all this money going home, and you have employees working for them who are aware that they're taking the money home, they could get together a group and go follow them home. There was one, I think it actually ended in a homicide in Pennsylvania a couple of years ago, where the family was attacked, home invasion, just as the guy was getting home with the money from the business. And we even had one in my community, say about 15 years ago, where an Asian family, home invasion, they were all tied up, and the money that they had in the house was taken. So that might be another way that culture could contribute to criminal activity. Subculture is a collection of values and preferences that is communicated to subcultural participants through the process of socialization. So here you're talking about smaller cultures within a larger culture that could be maybe geographic. And we talked a little bit about it in the classroom the other night. Geographical, if you were raised, say, in the South, and you have a certain way of doing things, whether it's in Mississippi or Louisiana or Georgia or wherever, and you move up to a city like Philadelphia and things are done totally differently, that could be considered subcultural. So you have geographic subcultures, you have say, racial and ethnic subcultures. And certainly you have the gang cultures. You have, any way that you can break down where people have a different set of values could be considered a subculture within the larger culture that we have. Moving on, we had Walter Miller, with regard to subcultures, suggested that certain subcultures might have what they call focal concerns. In other words, what's the key important values that these people in this culture might have. And Miller specifically studied so-called lower class people, or people in poverty, way back in 1958. And he found that some of the important concerns that these people had, or focal concerns, were the idea of trouble. And we're talking about staying out of trouble, getting into trouble, what have you. And that could be trouble with regard to drug use, could be pregnancy, could be a whole variety of things, but relatively minor issues they were talking about. How tough somebody was, how smart they were, the ability to search for excitement, fate, and autonomy. And the toughness, one of the things he mentions with regard to toughness is that part of the study, you had a lot of single-parent homes run by females. And the idea of toughness is that the males wanted to show that even though they were raised by a woman, they could still be tough. Neutralization, Sykes and Mazza, and we're in the section in your book entitled Delinquency and Drift, and how people become delinquent and then maybe drift away from their normal cultural values. But this concept of neutralization is that within the culture, within the subculture, you might have justifications that allow people who commit crimes to disavow or take away their own responsibility for their behavior. And this little chart, which is in your book, kind of tries to explain it. And there's also, if the chart kind of makes you dizzy because it's not on, all, you have to turn your head to read some of it, unless you're, really good like me. I can read it in whatever direction, but it's kind of hard. But they're also listed in your book. So one of them is denying responsibility. You look at the background: poverty, abuse, lack of opportunity. You say, I'm not responsible. It's not my fault. Something else caused it. It's how I was raised. It's the neighborhood. It's not my fault that I have to go out and rip people off. Denying injury. One example, it might be, well, everybody does it. If I rob somebody, their insurance company is going to pay for it. No big deal. They're not really going to lose anything. Deny the victim, saying that the victim deserved it. Maybe somebody who only beats up drunks, or people who only rob other drug dealers or whatever. Denying the victim. Condemning the condemners is another concept, where you basically suggest that the corrupt authorities, or the corrupt government, the corrupt police, or whatever, they're responsible for what you're doing. And appealing to higher loyalties. It's defending your family, defending your gang, defending your neighborhood, your significant other, whatever. It's okay for me to attack these guys over here because they are that other gang, they're on my turf, whatever. So those are those 5 ways that people might neutralize their own responsibility. Maybe they feel like less responsible or guilty for what they did because they basically write it off with one of these. Another real important theory with regard to culture conflict is differential opportunity, and the idea of legitimate opportunity structure versus an illegitimate opportunity structure. This was studied by Richard Cloward and Lloyd Olin. And basically, legitimate opportunities is what we're already experienced with or familiar with, talked about in some other theories as well, that there's that legitimate opportunity structure if it's available for you. And part of their study was, it suggested that some people have the ready availability to get a job, to go to college, get a good education, while others, and these might be those folks or people who are in the poverty-stricken communities, don't have the same legitimate opportunities. And there may be an existing illegitimate path, like getting involved in the drug gang or the drug distribution group or whatever, and working your way through that as a means to getting the opportunities or getting the goals that you want. Go back to when we were talking about goals and strain theory. We talked about the conformist who, and these are very similar. Strain theory with regard to goals and means, it's very similar to this differential opportunity theory, in that your conformist in strain theory was the person who is going to seek out the legitimate means to get to his legitimate goals. And your innovator under strain theory was the person who still wanted the goals, but we're going to seek out inappropriate or illegitimate means. So in differential opportunity theory, it suggests that there already is an existing illegitimate structure, that if the person feels that they can't do it the right way, they easily can jump into an illegitimate way. He also suggested it's also possible to create your own new path. Reaction formation in Cohen, basic definition: the process in which a person openly rejects that which he or she wants or aspires to but cannot achieve or obtain. Again, Albert Cohen was looking at folks who may not have the same opportunities as others, and because they feel that they cannot get that education, they cannot get that good job, they can't get that whatever good car, whatever they want, that they just totally reject everything. And if you want to go back and compare this to strain theory, this might be your retreatist who retreat into drugs. It might be your person who's involved in rebellion, who just says, the heck with this stuff. I want to just create my own and do my own thing. So reaction formation, basically Cohen suggested that not everybody is prepared because of their circumstances, whether it's their birth or their subsequent socialization. Not everybody's prepared to meet the expectation. And he said that people were generally measured by a so-called middle class measuring rod, and people who grow up in poverty in the lower class don't necessarily have what they need to reach where they want to go on that middle class measuring rod. So they have frustration, and then they have a reaction to that middle class, hate the middle class, reject the goals of the middle class, and maybe turn to crime. Okay, it's just another explanation, the same thing we basically just covered. When used to experience the same kind of alienations from middle class ideas band together, they achieve a collective and independent solution and create a delinquent subculture. So this might be, the formation of a gang within a community. And notice in the third edition of the book, let me just make sure, see if it's in the second edition as well. We're not going to discuss it a lot in the slides, but there is actually a section on gang. They call it gangs today, and kind of feeds off what we're talking about. This creation of a delinquent subculture is kind of what happens as a result of the rejection of the middle class ruler, if you will. And an interesting thing, when you look at gangs, not only here, but with regard to a whole lot of issues, where you have people that have basic needs to be accepted, to be loved, to get things. A lot of people find them within the structure of the gang if they can't find it in the structure of the family or some other means. All right, Code of the Street. Anderson, that's the last section in the book, in this third edition. It's also covered in the second edition, but keep in mind that the second edition is not necessarily in this exact same order. So that part is a little bit confusing. But basically, the code of the street is there's this notion of manhood, and it rests on the idea of respect. That, if you're disrespected, you can't back down. You have to stand up for yourself. You have to, make people respect you, and that could turn to violence. And it could mean that if you feel disrespected because somebody says something to you that's out of place, that you go to next level, and either fists or knives or guns. And unfortunately, what we're finding on our own streets in Philadelphia today is it often becomes the guns. And look at Chicago last year, the guns. This study, The Code of the Street, was done by Elijah Anderson, who was a University of Pennsylvania sociologist, and it was published back in 1990. And it is available if you go through the library and do a search for Anderson Code of the Street. You can find it. It was actually done right here in Philadelphia in the Germantown section off Germantown Avenue, and he was looking at Philly people, in the late 80s. But you might find, reading through it, that some of the things that he's talking about with regard to respect and the need for respect, the whole idea of respect, and that people should get what's due to them, still exists today to some degree. And what happens under this code of the street is people who are so-called streetwise people, they learn to outsmart or hustle others while avoid being taken advantage of themselves. And another thing he talked about is, and this is what the people within the community talked about, decent families versus so-called street families. The decent family was your hard-working family who was going through the legitimate structure, where your street family was the one who was going, and maybe your illegitimate structure. So you can compare this a little bit, this idea, to that differential opportunity theory that we're just talking about, the difference between people who are following a legitimate opportunity structure versus the illegitimate opportunity structure. All right, some of the critiques of culture conflict is they said it really didn't explain anything. You say you have these conflicts between various cultures, but you didn't explain, like, why were they having conflicts? What came first, the chicken or the egg? Was it the fact that they had differences that created crime, or was it the crime that created the differences? Again, I will point you back to the article about the Brewery Town section of Philadelphia. Could we have some issues there with a culture conflict? It was also criticized for being racist because many of the so-called violent subcultures were populated primarily by minorities, whether it be blacks or Hispanics primarily, and even some Asians. It's like, well, you're labeling those people. And even though, and one of the critiques by another person by the name of Anderson, a female, suggested that even though it may be true that rates of violence are higher in black communities, this observation does not explain the fact. So, sociological jargon, as it says in the book, one might say that an observed correlation between race and violence does not necessarily provide a workable explanation for the relationship. So what she's basically saying is, yeah, we see violence and we see it associated with these particular people, this particular group, but is it because of the group, or is there something else that we're not seeing? And, the complaint was, if you're calling out the group for the violence, then that's allegedly racist. All right, so that's the end of this section on culture conflict. We're going to take up in the next section looking at the overall policy implications of sociological or social structure theories of crime. How can we use this knowledge to create laws and programming that's going to help to make things better within our communities. And that is actually the subject of question number 7. That's part of your assignment for this week. So if you choose question number 7, the next section that we're going to cover in video is going to specifically address that particular question. So we'll see you in the next one. Remember, this is number 4 of 5 on Criminology, 3rd edition.